Welcome to Nightmares at 3 a.m. From now on, I'll be your company. Here, we dive into real stories, pulled from Reddit or sent to us by people who lived through them. Tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it there? We'd love to know more about you. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Now turn off the lights. Get comfortable, because tonight's story started with a new neighbor and ended very, very badly. My name is Thomas, and I'm a software engineer. I spend most of my days in front of a screen, which makes choosing where to live a crucial part of my life. I've always preferred quiet, residential neighborhoods with tree-lined streets and a sense of community that you don't find in the city center. That's why I moved to the house on Oak Creek in Columbus, Ohio. It was the perfect place, a charming townhouse with a small backyard for my dog Buster and neighbors who seemed to have known each other for years. The house next door, however, was empty when I moved in. The sold sign sat on the lawn for about 2 weeks until one Tuesday, a moving truck finally showed up. I'm not the type to peek out the window, but it's hard not to notice when a new neighbor moves in. He was a middle-aged man, maybe in his early 50s, named Arthur. He had a scholarly air to him, with his wire-rimmed glasses and gray hair swept to the side. I waved to him from my porch, and he smiled back. My first impression was that he was reserved, maybe a little shy. He didn't seem to have much furniture, which made me think he might be going through a divorce or something. Simple, everyday situations like moving always make me wonder about the story behind things. The first few days were normal. I would see Arthur leaving for work in the morning and returning in the late afternoon, always at the same time. He drove a generic gray sedan, the kind you forget about as soon as he turns the corner. His routine was so precise that I could set my watch by it. It was this predictability that made the first oddity so striking. It started with the trash. Every week, the night before collection, I would take my trash cans out to the sidewalk. Arthur did the same, but his trash can was always empty, completely empty. I could see the lid blow open in the wind. There wasn't a single bag inside. At first, I rationalized it. Maybe he ate out every day. Maybe he recycled everything, even though I never saw him use the recycling bin. It was strange, but explainable. Soon after, I noticed something else. The windows in his house. During the day, the blinds were always closed. All of them. At night, however, a single upstairs window was lit, but the blinds remained down. It was the window in what I assumed was the master bedroom, the one facing mine. Sometimes, late at night, when I took Buster out for his last walk, I would see a silhouetted against the light. The shape of a man, standing, looking in the direction of my house. Again, I tried to find some logic. He might just be staring down the street, lost in thought. That's what people do. But it happened so often that it began to bother me. The silence in his house was something else. I never heard music, television, or even the sound of footsteps. It was as if, other than that single light and the occasional silhouette, the house was unoccupied. The feeling that something was off began to set in. I remember one day in particular, I was in my backyard trying to fix a loose fence, and Buster started barking in the direction of Arthur's house. It wasn't the excited bark of someone who sees a squirrel, but a low, defensive growl. I glanced up at the upstairs window, and for a split second, I swore I saw the blinds move as if someone were peering through a crack. But when I blinked, everything was still again. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought. But the doubt was already there. Fear, when it starts, isn't a scream. It's a whisper you try to ignore, a cognitive dissonance that makes you question your own perception of reality. I've always had a poor memory for movie titles, but I distinctly remember a quote from a director, what was his name? A master of suspense. Oh yes, Hitchcock. He said that terror lies not in noise, but in silence. Arthur's house was the personification of this, a dense, observant silence. I felt watched, but in a passive, almost indifferent way. It was a feeling that infiltrated my routine, transforming the comfort of my home into a stage under an invisible spotlight. And the worst part was the complete lack of evidence. How could I explain it to anyone? My neighbor is too quiet and doesn't produce any trash. I would sound like a madman. I was alone with this growing feeling that the tranquility of that street was just a facade, and that something deeply wrong lived right next door. Trying to rationalize Arthur's behavior became a daily exercise. I convinced myself that he was just an eccentric man, someone who valued his privacy to an almost pathological degree. But the tranquility I had sought in Oak Creek was fading, replaced by a low-grade anxiety. The turning point, the first real break in logic, came about a month after he arrived. It was a Wednesday night. I had been working late on a project, and the house was completely silent. Buster was sleeping at my feet. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound coming from my backyard. It was a metallic, rhythmic noise. Clink, pause, clink, pause. My first thought was a raccoon rummaging through the trash cans, even though I had stored them in the garage. I got up and walked to the kitchen window, which faced the back. The night was dark, but my back neighbor's security light partially illuminated the area. And then I saw him. Arthur. He was in my backyard, standing next to the tire swing that the previous owner had left hanging from a large oak tree. He was holding a small gardening shovel and methodically digging a hole in the ground. Clink, pause, clink. The sound was the shovel hitting small stones in the ground. I froze watching him. He didn't seem hurried or furtive. There was an unsettling calm in his movements. After a few minutes, he stopped, placed something small in the hole, I couldn't see what, and covered it with dirt, compacting it carefully with his foot. Then he simply turned, walked back to his property, and disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was beyond reason. There was no logical explanation for my neighbor digging a hole in my yard at 2 in the morning. The next day, I waited for him to leave for work. As soon as his car turned the corner, I grabbed a shovel and drove to the spot. The ground was exactly as he had left it, the disturbed dirt barely standing out from the rest of the lawn. I started digging, a foot, 2 feet deep. Then my shovel hit something hard. I pushed the dirt away with my hands and pulled out the object. It was a small tape recorder, the old-fashioned micro-cassette kind. My stomach turned. I carried it inside, my hands shaking. I didn't have a player for it, and part of me didn't want to know what was recorded there. This object was confirmation, proof that I wasn't imagining things. I remembered something my father, a former police officer, used to say about human nature. People don't do things without a reason. Even the craziest acts have an internal logic. What What was Arthur's logic? The surveillance, the weirdness? Now this. I decided I needed outside help. I called the police, but I hesitated over what to say. My neighbor buried a tape recorder in my backyard. It sounded like the ravings of a paranoid. Instead, I reported a break-in, saying I'd seen a man in my yard at night. A police officer came, a bored-looking young man. He walked the perimeter, found no signs of forced entry, and took down my information. "Probably someone looking for unlocked cars," he said lamely. "Turn up the outside lighting. There's not much else we can do." I felt completely helpless and isolated. The authority figure who was supposed to be protecting me was eyeing me suspiciously, and the object I held in my hand seemed more like a trap to me than to Arthur. From that day on, the atmosphere changed. Subtle fear was replaced by a sense of imminent danger. I bought a cheap cassette player online. When it arrived, I stared at the package for hours before opening it. I knew that when I pressed play, I would cross a threshold from which I could not return. I followed the writer Joan Didion's thought. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. At that moment, the story I was telling myself was that of a strange neighbor. I feared that the tape would tell me a much, much worse story. Finally, at night, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, I put the microcassette in the player. The sound was low and hissing. There was a long silence, and then a voice. My voice. It was a recording of a phone conversation I had had with my sister a few days earlier. We had talked about work, about Buster, about our plans for the holiday. The recording went on for several minutes and then stopped. A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't just watching me, he was listening to me. Paranoia blossomed into certainty. How had he managed this? The tape recorder wasn't broadcasting. It had to have been recovered. That meant what I saw wasn't the first time he had been in my yard. How many other holes were there? How many other tapes were buried under the grass where my dog played? The house, my safe haven, now felt violated at its most fundamental level. The threat was no longer just on the other side of the fence. Somehow, it was already inside. Fear became my constant companion. Every creak of the floorboards, every slow-moving car on the street was an extension of Arthur's presence. The cassette tape was locked in my drawer, a small plastic box that contained the proof of my sanity and my torment. I became the observer. I began to watch his house with the same intensity I had once felt emanating from it. But his routine did not change. The same precision, the same silence, the same lit-up window at night. The normalcy of his facade was almost more frightening than any overt threat. It was a cold, silent war fought through the fences and windows of an American suburb. The final climb happened on a Saturday night. I couldn't sleep. I was sitting in the darkness of my living room, just staring at his house. Around 3 a.m, the light in the upstairs window went out. That never happened. Usually it stayed on until dawn. A few minutes later, the front door of his house opened. Arthur came out. He was dressed in his usual clothes, but he was carrying a small carry-on bag. He walked to his car, put the bag on the back seat, got in, and drove off. Without looking back, he just drove away. I stood there in shock. Was that it? Had he just given up and left? A wave of relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. But it was followed by a gnawing doubt. Why? Why now? I spent the rest of the night and the next day in a haze of uncertainty. His house remained dark and silent. On the third day, a for sale sign from a different real estate agency appeared on the lawn. It was real. He was gone. Curiosity, however, was an itch I needed to scratch. I needed to understand. The house was empty. One night, driven by a mixture of fear and a need for closure, I did something I never thought I would. I broke onto his property. The back door was, to my surprise, unlocked. I walked in. The inside of the house was Spartan, nearly empty. There was a couch, a table, and a chair in the living room. The kitchen was clean and put away, but the refrigerator was empty except for a bottle of water. It was like a set, not a home. I walked upstairs, my heart pounding. The room with the lighted window was the only one with the most furniture. There was an unmade bed, a dresser, and a chair positioned in front of the window. The window that looked out onto my house. On the wall opposite the window were pinned dozens of photographs. They were pictures of me walking Buster, me getting the mail, me working in my garden. There were pictures taken through my window showing me in my living room, my kitchen. There were hundreds of them, and next to them were detailed notes. My schedule, the times I left and came back, my sister's name, details of the conversation on the tape. Then I saw an envelope on the small table next to my chair with my name, Thomas, written in impeccable handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a confession. It was a job offer from a private security company I'd never heard of. The letter praised my observational skills, my resilience under pressure, and my situational awareness. It said I had been suspected and that they believed I would be an excellent asset to their organization. The salary offered was astronomical. At the bottom of the page was a sentence, "Security is not a product. It is a process. Some observe, some are observed. We make sure the right people are doing each role. Mr. Arthur was merely the evaluator. The job is yours, if you want it." I staggered out of that house, feeling the world spin. The terror wasn't about a crazy neighbor. It was about a system, a corporation that turned paranoia into a recruitment test. Arthur wasn't a threat. He was just an employee. I remember a quote I read once by a philosopher whose name escapes me now. Something about how the most terrifying evil is the kind that is banal, administrative, carried out by ordinary people following orders. I never responded to the letter. I sold the house within a month at a loss. I moved to an apartment downtown, an anonymous, noisy place where no one knows my name. But the closure I sought never came. The threat didn't go away. It just became abstract and omnipresent. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I find myself wondering, is this really over? Or am I just in another stage of reckoning? Is the banality of evil our inability to recognize it when it wears a suit and offers us a job? I don't know. And what scares me, what really keeps me awake at 3 a.m, is that I may never know the difference between being safe and being watched. My name is Clara, and I'm a graphic designer. I've always liked the smell of ozone that hangs in the Portland air right after it rains. There's something cleansing about it. I moved here 6 months ago into one of those old brick buildings with a lot of character, which is what realtors call things that are old and a little crooked. For me, it was a fresh start after a particularly bad breakup. The apartment was small, but it had a huge window in the living room, and I could work while watching the clouds roll by. My mistake, I realize now, was underestimating the importance of the walls that separate us from others. Mrs. Gable, my neighbor in 3B, the apartment next door to mine, introduced herself on the first day. An elderly woman with white hair neatly pulled into a bun and a permanent scent of cinnamon. She brought me a plate of cookies and a smile that seemed genuine. "Welcome to our little nest, honey," she said. I thought the gesture was sweet, a holdover from a more communal era. The awkwardness began subtly, almost imperceptibly. She seemed to know things. "I see you work from home. How wonderful to have that flexibility," she said in the hallway a week later. I hadn't mentioned my work to anyone. I rationalized that she must have seen my monitor light on during the day. Then the comments became more specific. "I hope your mother is feeling better," she said one day as I was picking up my mail. I had spoken to my mother on the phone the night before about a bad case of the flu she had. The conversation had taken place inside my apartment, with the windows closed. I felt a chill run down my spine. How do you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She giggled. "Oh, the walls are like paper in here, honey. You hear everything. But don't worry, I'm keeping your secret." She blinked, as if we were sharing an amusing confidence. But it wasn't amusing. It was deeply disturbing. From then on, I lived in a state of paralyzing self-consciousness. Every phone call, every song I listened to at low volume, every step I took seemed to be for an audience of one. I began wearing headphones constantly. I once had to remember the name of an old client. It was a floral design company. What was it called? Petal and Pixel? No. Oh yes, Bloom and Brush. The effort to remember something so trivial while feeling like my privacy was being eaten away was exhausting. The terror came not from a physical threat, but from the complete annihilation of my private space. My home, my sanctuary, had become a one-way confessional. I remember a quote I read. As Susan Sontag said, "All terror is a form of knowledge." I followed that line of thinking, and the knowledge I was gaining was that I no longer had a life of my own. I had a life that was passively consumed every day by the woman next door. The breaking point was a small package left on my doorstep. Inside was a slightly worn silver picture frame. There was a note. "I saw yours was broken. This would look lovely on your desk. Love, Eleanor Gable." The week before, I had bumped into my desk and knocked over a cheap picture frame, shattering the glass. I had thrown it in the trash inside my apartment. She couldn't have heard that. She couldn't have viewed that one. That night, driven by cold desperation, I waited until I was sure she was asleep. I turned off all the lights and pressed my ear to the wall that divided our rooms. Silence. Then, with my fingertips, I began to follow the baseboard, looking for any imperfection. And I found it. Behind an old disused ventilation grill, I felt a thin, almost invisible wire. I pulled it carefully. At the end, a microphone the size of a pinhead. There was no confrontation. There was no shouting. The next day, I gave my landlord my notice, citing a family emergency. I packed my things in silence, feeling her eyes on me through the drywall and brick. On my last day, as I was leaving, I passed Mrs. Gable in the hallway. She gave me that same sweet, icy smile. "Leaving already, dear? What a shame. You were such an interesting neighbor." Today, I live in a modern building with concrete walls and state-of-the-art soundproofing, but the feeling has never completely left me. What happened left me with a constant reflection on the fragility of our privacy. My grandfather, who was a very private man, used to say, "Your home is your castle, but even castles have ears in the walls." Are we really safe anywhere? Or does proximity to strangers always make us vulnerable in ways we cannot predict? I don't have the answer, and it is this uncertainty that sometimes still keeps me awake at night. My name is Leo, and for the past 3 months, my world has been the view from my living room window. A leg broken in 2 places does that to you. It limits your universe. I've always thought the monotony of suburban Denver was overrated. There's quiet drama in every house if you look closely enough. And for lack of a choice, I did. That's when I noticed Mr. Henderson, my neighbor across the street. He was an elderly man, thin and bent with age, who seemed too frail for the Colorado wind, and every day, promptly at 4 o'clock, he would come out of the house with a green watering can and do something inexplicable. He would water a cement slab in the middle of his yard. At first, I thought it was a symptom of old age, a mental confusion. Perhaps he thought there was a flower bed there that existed only in his memory. It was sad, but harmless. I watched the ritual with a kind of distant pity. He did not just throw the water willy-nilly. There was a method. He started in the upper left corner and moved in methodical lines back and forth until the entire gray surface was dark and wet. He was never absent. Come rain or shine, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Henderson was there with his watering can. My brother, when I described the scene over the phone, laughed. "You're so bored, Leo. You're starting to see poetry where there's only a dotard." Maybe he was right. I tried to ignore it, to read a book, to focus on the freelance work I was doing, but my gaze always returned to the window just before 4. His habit had become mine. I remembered a concept I'd read once in that book by, what's that French sociologist's name? About how rituals give order to chaos. Maybe that was all it was. Mr. Henderson's small act of control against the entropy of the universe. But the chaos, I would discover, was being carefully cultivated. After about 6 weeks of observation, I noticed something that at first I thought was a trick of the light. The cement slab no longer seemed so solid. In the center, where the water had collected the longest, a dark, permanent stain had formed. And it wasn't just a damp stain, it looked darker, deeper, almost organic. I leaned closer to the window, the cast on my leg scraping against the floor. No, I wasn't imagining it. The cement was changing color from the inside out. There was no logical explanation for this. Cement doesn't absorb water like that. It dries. His didn't. Curiosity turned into a low-grade obsession. The dark stain grew slowly but surely, like a bizarre mold. Some days, in bright sunlight, I swore I could see the surface of the stain rippling slightly like the skin of a sleeping animal. I knew it was impossible. I knew that boredom and painkillers must be playing tricks on my mind. I follow Philip K. Dick's line, "Reality is the thing that when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away." And the stain wouldn't go away. My leg finally healed. The first day I could walk without crutches, I knew what I had to do. I waited for Mr. Henderson to leave for his weekly grocery shopping, which he did every Tuesday morning. With my heart pounding in my throat, I crossed the street and entered his yard. The grass was sparse and dry except around the cement slab, where it was strangely lush. Up close, the slab was even more disturbing. The central stain wasn't a stain at all. The texture of the cement here was different, softer, almost porous. Hesitantly, I reached out and touched it. It wasn't cold and hard as stone. It was warm and gave slightly under my finger, like rubber or thick leather. A smell rose up, an odor of wet earth and something else, something vaguely metallic like old blood. An impulse came over me, a mixture of fear and fascination. I went back to my house, picked up a small gardening trowel, and returned. I knelt down and, with a shaken hand, poked at the soft part of the cement. The surface split with sickening ease. There was no gravel or dirt beneath. There was a dark cavity, a void, and from that void, a sound, a low, wet sound of breathing. Paralyzed with horror, I peered into the small hole I had made. In the darkness, something moved. Two pale, round shapes focused on me. They were eyes, and the eyes were exactly my own. For a heart-stopping split second, I stared into a perfect replica of my own face, staring back at me from beneath the earth before it receded into the depths. I stumbled back, gasping, and ran into my house, locking the door. I never looked into Mr. Henderson's yard again. A week later, I put my house on the market. I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was a hallucination, a mental breakdown brought on by isolation. Or maybe Mr. Henderson wasn't watering the cement. Maybe he was feeding whatever was growing underneath. And maybe, somehow, it was feeding on the observer. As my father used to say about the secrets of the desert where he grew up. There are things that weren't meant for us to understand. They were just meant for us to know to stay away. Does the world have more of these secret gardens hidden in plain sight? And what happens when we inadvertently water them with our attention? These are questions that I carry with me, and they make me look at the ground in a very different way now. My name is Maya, and I work in sound. More specifically, I'm a podcast editor, which means I spend my days hunting down and eliminating the tiniest unwanted sounds. The smacking of a lip, the hum of a refrigerator, the echo of an ill-prepared room. As such, I've always believed that silence isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of the right sound. I moved into an old building in Chicago, drawn by the thick walls that promised peace, and for 3 glorious months, I had it, until apartment 4B, next door to mine, was taken. The new neighbor was a man named Silas, tall, thin, with a gaze that always seemed to be focused on something behind you. He introduced himself briefly in the hallway, saying he was a composer. "I hope I'm not disturbing you with my cello," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I smiled back and said it would be no problem. It was a mistake. The music started the next night, and it wasn't normal. It wasn't the awkward practice of a beginner or the complex melody of a professional. It was dissonant, a collage of long, drawn-out notes that seemed to twist in the air. The melodies rose to high peaks and then plunged to frequencies so low that I felt them vibrating in my chest more than I heard them. As a professional, I knew something was wrong. There was a technical term for when frequencies overlapped in the wrong way, a kind of phantom resonance? No, that wasn't it. Oh yes, intermodulation artifact. His music was a tangle of sound artifacts, as if it were not being played but rather leaked into our reality. The music had a physical effect. Headaches and anxiety that settled deep in my stomach. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake up with a particular melody of his in my head, a sequence of 3 descending notes that sounded like a sigh of despair. My home, my studio of silence, had been invaded by a noise pollution that seemed to have a purpose. A week later, I found a black flash drive stuck to my door with a note written in elegant, choppy handwriting. A sample of my composition. True harmony requires a dedicated listener. I hope you enjoy it. Silas. My blood ran cold. The threat was no longer passive. It was an invitation. He wanted me to listen carefully. He wanted me to become a dedicated listener. I shouldn't have done that. Every fiber of my being and every year of my professional experience screamed that I should throw that flash drive in the trash, but curiosity is a disease. I took the flash drive to my studio, plugged it into an old laptop that wasn't connected to the internet, and with my heart in my mouth, opened the audio file in my editing software. What I saw on the screen frightened me more than the sound. The waveform was a monstrosity. It was jagged and chaotic, with peaks that reached the digital limit and valleys that plunged to absolute zero. Perfect digital silence, a void that should not exist in an analog recording of an instrument, and within the frequencies of the cello, hidden like subliminal messages, were other things. Using my filters, I isolated the subharmonics. There were whispers, indistinguishable words in a language I didn't recognize, and there was another sound, an organic rhythm, low and steady, the sound of a heart beating slowly. At that moment, staring at that impossible soundscape, I remembered a quote. I follow Friedrich Nietzsche's line, "And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." I wasn't just listening to music, I was staring into a sonic abyss. That's when the cello started playing in the apartment next door. The same melody from the file, the same sequence of notes I was seeing on my screen. My entire body shivered. Then the unthinkable happened. Through my headphones, coming of the recording, I heard a new sound, 2 soft knocks, like someone knocking on wood. And at the same moment, I heard 2 soft knocks on my apartment door. I ripped off my headphones. The silence in my room was total, but the vibration of the sound coming from the wall continued. The knocking on my door sounded again, a little louder this time. "Maya!" Silas's voice sounded through the wood, calm and terribly intimate. "I know you're listening. The play is only complete with your participation." I didn't answer. I didn't make a single sound. That night, I packed a bag with shaking hands, abandoned my equipment, my apartment, my silence, and left. I never looked back. What was that music? A weapon? A way to communicate with something that was never meant to be contacted? Or was it just the sound of one man's madness, so powerful that it became contagious? My grandfather, who was a radio engineer, said that there are frequencies we cannot hear for a reason. They are not meant for us. Maybe Silas found one of them. Sometimes, when it is very quiet, I still hear a low hum in my ear, the echo of those notes. Could the silence I sought so long have been lost forever, filled with the echo of a harmony that was never meant to be? My name is David. I have always found comfort in order. In architecture, my chosen profession, every line has a purpose. Every material is selected for a reason. In my life, I tried to apply the same principle. My apartment was my sanctuary of logic and precision. Every object had its place. Until Mr. Alastair arrived in apartment 5B, the unit that shared a wall with mine. He was a remarkably ordinary middle-aged man, the kind who gets lost in the crowd. We exchanged a nod in the hallway. He was the epitome of the undisturbed neighbor. The problem started so subtly that at first I blamed my own brain. It started with my favorite coffee mug. I'd bought it at that little pottery shop in, what was the name of the town? On a trip up the coast. Oh yes, Astoria. It was a deep blue, with a comforting weight in my hand. One morning when I picked it up, it felt wrong. The color was a shade lighter. The weight was a little less. It was almost identical, but it was a copy. I thought maybe the original had cracked and I'd thrown it away and forgotten about it. A lapse of memory. But then other things started happening. A hardcover book on Mies van der Rohe on my shelf, which I was sure was a first edition, was now a paperback reprint. The pen I kept on my desk, a black Lamy, was replaced by a cheap imitation, but with the same color and shape. These were small, almost insignificant changes. They were plausible. I could have been mistaken. I could have been stressed, forgotten. I began to doubt my own mind, my perception of reality. The denial shattered on a Tuesday. In my living room, I kept a single framed photograph of my parents smiling on a pier, taken on their anniversary. This morning, the picture was different. The same scene, the same pier, my parents in the same clothes. But the pose was slightly different. In my original photo, my mother was looking at the camera. In this one, she was looking at my father. It was a photo taken a second before or a second after the one I knew. It was irrefutable proof that something was going on. This photo was unique. There were no copies. My heart pounding, I knocked on the door of 5B. Mr. Alastair answered, looking mildly confused. I asked as calmly as I could if he hadn't come into my apartment by mistake. He looked at me as if I were crazy. "Of course not," he said with disarming sincerity. "I hardly leave the house. Why do you ask?" His denial was so convincing that for a moment the doubt crept back into my mind. Was I losing my mind? I needed proof. The feeling of being subtly erased, replaced piece by piece, was maddening. I bought a small security camera and hid it on a bookshelf, pointed at my front door. The wait was agonizing. The next day, after spending 8 hours at the office, I returned home and, with shaking hands, reviewed the footage, and there it was. At 2:03 p.m., the lock on my door clicked. Mr. Alastair walked in. He didn't look like a burglar. There was no hurry or stealth. There was a methodical calm in his manner. He walked over to a small lamp I had by the couch, unplugged it, and replaced it with another, nearly identical one he'd brought in a bag. He lingered for a moment, adjusting the angle of the shade so it was exactly like the old one, and then he was gone. The banality of the act was the most terrifying thing. He wasn't stealing, he was healing. He was editing my space, my life, with a cold precision. I follow Milan Kundera's line. Man's struggle against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. I was in a silent struggle for my own memory, against a power I couldn't understand. That night, I decided to turn the tables. If he could enter my world, I would enter his. I waited until late, and using a set of lockpicks I had purchased online for hobby purposes, opened the door to 5B. I expected to find my original objects, a nest of my stolen possessions. But the apartment was empty. Completely. utterly empty. There was no furniture, no boxes, no dust. The air was still and odorless. The walls were white and bare. The floor was spotless. It was a vacuum, an absence of life. And in the exact center of the living room, on the polished wood floor, there was a single object, my blue Astoria coffee mug, the original. As I stared at her, mesmerized, I heard the sound of a key in the lock. I panicked and hid in the only place I could, a built-in closet near the entrance. The door opened. Mr. Allister walked in, but he wasn't alone. There was a young couple with him. As you can see, the apartment is in perfect condition, ready to move in, Allister said, in the professional voice of a real estate agent. The woman smiled. What about the neighborhood? Is it quiet? Mr. Allister glanced briefly in the direction of my wall. Oh yes, very much so. Your neighbor, the one in 5A, is a very quiet man, an architect. He doesn't bother anyone. I escaped as soon as they left. I left the mug behind. I left the apartment the next day. What was Mr. Allister doing? Was he a broker, a deranged performance artist, or something much worse? The exchange of objects was not the end goal. It was a process, a preparation. He was not stealing from me. He was emptying me. To this day, the question haunts me. Was he studying me so he could replicate me somewhere else? Or was he preparing me for something, cleaning up the rough edges of my identity? And the scariest question of all, if he changed every piece of my life, at what point would I stop being myself and become his copy? My name is Julia, and my garden has always been my refuge. I am a botanist, and for me, a garden is a way of communicating with life, a place where the rules of biology make sense. Each plant, each flower, was chosen and cared for. It was a little piece of the world that I could understand and control. That, of course, was before Mrs. Vera arrived. She moved in next door, a frail-looking lady with a kind smile, and in her first week, she installed 3 large beehives near the fence that divided us. My first reaction was one of professional concern. Bees are vital, but they can be selective. To my surprise, her bees seemed to have no interest in my garden. My years of work, a riot of color and nectar, was completely ignored. Instead, I saw them in strange places. They gathered in damp patches on the picket fence, on decaying leaves in the corner of the yard, around a small puddle of rainwater that had formed near my basement. It was unnatural behavior. Bees seek pollen, not decay. Their buzzing was wrong too. It wasn't the vibrant, energetic sound I was familiar with. It was a low buzzing, almost subsonic trill that seemed to penetrate more into the skull than the ears. I remembered my college classes on pollinators. There was the solitary bee, megachile. No, it was another. Oh yes, Xylocopa, the bumblebee, which bored into the wood. But these were honeybees, or at least they appeared to be. Their behavior didn't fit with anything I had ever studied. One afternoon, Mrs. Vera called me to the fence. "Dear Julia," she said with that constant smile, to make up for any inconvenience. She handed me a glass jar. Inside was a honey so dark amber it was almost black. It had the consistency of tar, and when I opened it, the smell was not floral or sweet. It smelled of damp earth, of ozone and something else, something vaguely metallic. I thanked her, my stomach knotting. I knew with a certainty I could not explain that this honey did not come from any flower. Things escalated when the bees began to enter my home, not in swarms, but one or two at a time, silently and persistently. I would find them in the darkest, quietest places. One, dead, inside a lampshade. Another, slowly crawling up the wall of my closet. They weren't aggressive. They just appeared. They were sentinels of a slow, uncaring invasion. My haven was being violated by a force of nature that refused to play by the rules. I have always been struck by a quote from the filmmaker Werner Herzog, who, like me, had a complex view of the natural world. I follow his line of thinking. Nature is vile and mean. My job as a botanist has always been to find beauty and order in this savagery. But what was happening in my house was not beautiful. It was a perversion of order. The fear peaked on a moonless night. I couldn't sleep. The low humming seemed to have taken up permanent residence within the walls of my home. I got up and began following the sound. It was loudest on the wall I shared with Mrs. Smith's house. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, and what I heard froze my blood. It was not just the hum of thousands of bees. Beneath it, there was another sound. Mrs. Vera was singing, or rather humming. She was making a single note, low and monotonous, in perfect tune with the creatures. It was the fundamental note of that unholy hive. Then I heard a wet, slowly tearing sound, and her voice, an intimate whisper that passed through the wall. "Yes, my dears," she said, "the house is nearly finished. Old wood is the best, the sweetest." I understood in that moment. The bees weren't ignoring my flowers. They were feeding on the decay. They were consuming the structure of my house, the old wood, the moisture, the slow rot that exists in any building. And Mrs. Vera wasn't a beekeeper. She was a shepherd. The dark honey on my counter wasn't a gift. It was a product. The product of my home being devoured. My grandfather, a carpenter, used to knock on the wood in the walls and say, "Strong bones." He believed in the solidity of things. What if solidity is an illusion? What if we live in structures that are constantly being consumed by ecosystems we cannot see? The next day, I listed the house for sale. The new owner praised the property's rustic charm. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the charm was the sound of his house being eaten alive. My name is Arthur, and I am a retired history professor. I have always believed that history teaches us above all to doubt fantastical narratives, to seek the most likely explanation, however banal. My post-academic life was an exercise in this belief. Quiet reading on the porch, the sound of sprinklers, the predictable order of a well-kept suburb. That order was shattered when the Bannisters moved in next door. They were an overly cheerful couple who, in their first week, committed what I considered an aesthetic crime. They infested their perfectly manicured lawn with garden gnomes. Dozens of them. Gnomes fishing in a plastic wishing well, gnomes pushing wheelbarrows, gnomes sleeping under ceramic mushrooms. They were colorful, cheap, and, in my opinion, hideous. But the offense at first was only visual, a daily reminder of the banality of bad taste. I ignored them, focusing on my books and the peaceful passing of the hours. It was during one of these afternoons of reading that I began to feel something, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. When I turned my head to look, nothing. The gnomes were exactly where they should be, frozen in their stupid plaster smiles. Eye strain, I told myself. The afternoon sun. but the feeling persisted. And then I noticed the real oddity. It wasn't in the gnomes, it was in their shadows. As a man who has spent his life in classrooms, I know light and how it works. The shadows cast by those gnomes were wrong. Subtle, but wrong. The shadow of one beckoning gnome seemed to have slightly longer fingers. The shadow of another, leaning over a wheelbarrow, seemed to be looking up at me. It was an impossible dissonance. I was reminded of a concept from Greek philosophy. The allegory of, what was it called? Ah, yes, Plato's cave, where shadows were the only reality for the prisoners. Maybe I was becoming a prisoner on my own balcony. The realization that I wasn't crazy came at dusk. The sun was low, casting long, dark silhouettes across the banister's lawn. I was watching one particular gnome, one holding a small flashlight. Its shadow was stretching toward me, and then I saw it. The shadow separated from the gnome's base. It stretched like a dark liquid across the lawn boundary and touched the toe of my shoe. I felt a chill that didn't come from the night breeze. The moment a car turned a corner, illuminating the yard with its headlights, the shadow instantly retreated, returning to a harmless speck at the feet of its ceramic owner. The lawn beyond was no longer a neutral space. It became a stage for a silent, perverse theater that only I could see. The shadows took on a life of their own. I saw the shadow of a gnome with a fishing rod dip his line into the shadow of a bird flying past. I saw the shadows of two gnomes lean toward each other as if sharing a secret. They never moved when I looked directly at them, only when my attention was divided. It was a mocking ballet in my peripheral vision, a form of psychological harassment performed by pure darkness. I was living a waking nightmare, one that defied every law of physics I knew. I follow H.P. Lovecraft's line. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest of all fears is the fear of the unknown. I, a man of facts and logic, was face to face with the absolutely unknown, and it took the form of a garden gnome. Desperate to prove my sanity to myself, I decided to take action. If shadows were the problem, the solution was their absence. I waited for nightfall and set up a powerful construction spotlight in my backyard, pointing it directly at the ceramic army. My plan was simple: flood their lawn with so much light that no shadows could form. Heart in my throat, I plugged the cord into an outdoor outlet. The light exploded blinding white, and for a split second, before the entire neighborhood circuit breaker tripped with an audible click, I saw it. The shadows weren't lying on the ground, they were standing. Three-dimensional figures of pure darkness, untethered from their gnomes, their outlines sharp against the light, and all of them, every single one of them, were turned toward me, staring at me. Then everything went black and silent. The next morning, Mr. Bannister knocked on my door, smiling as ever. He was holding my extension cord. "Good morning, neighbor." "I think this is yours," he said with a friendly wink. "It seems you overloaded the network last night. It happens." He paused and his smile became a little more fixed. "You know, you have to be careful. Some things don't like too much light." The warning was clear, though perfectly deniable. I sold a house in the spring. I moved into an apartment on the 12th floor where the only shadow I see is my own. My grandfather used to say that the devil is in the details. I would say that he is in the shadows that the details cast. How many things are happening in the corners of our eyes that our rational brains refuse to process? and what happens when the owners of those shadows realize that you, and only you, are paying attention. My name is Elise, and I've always felt that living alone was a form of freedom. I lived in a small duplex with my cat, Leo, and my world was contained, quiet, and safe. The difference between solitude and isolation is a fine line, and I walked it carefully. My equilibrium was disturbed when Mr. Caspian moved into the duplex next door. He was an elderly, impeccably dressed man with pianist's hands and a gentle smile that seemed etched into his face. A perfect neighbor, I thought. The first gift arrived on my doorstep on a Monday morning. It was a sparrow, but it wasn't dead in the usual sense. It was perfectly preserved, mounted on a small polished wooden plaque, its wings slightly spread as if it were about to take flight. It was a piece of taxidermy of eerie perfection. There was no note. Later, I met Mr. Caspian in the garden, and he simply smiled. "I see you like birds," he said in his soft voice. "It's a little hobby of mine." I was speechless. It was a bizarre gesture, but I chalked it up to the eccentricity of a lonely man trying to be friendly. A week later, a field mouse appeared, curled up as if asleep. Then a squirrel, its fluffy tail arched in an artistic flourish. Each piece was a masterpiece of stillness, life perfectly imitating death. The beauty of the work only made it more macabre. I began to feel an icy dread every morning when I opened the door. This gesture, which should have been one of friendship, felt like a contamination and introduction of death to my doorstep. I remember seeing a particular bird in my yard the previous few days, one with a red breast, a type of finch. What was its name? Oh yes, a farmhouse mexicanus. I didn't see him anymore. The tipping point, the shift from eccentric to terrifying, was a different kind of gift. In a glass dome sat a monarch butterfly, its wings spread. The previous afternoon, I had spent hours in my backyard, drawing in my notebook the very monarchs that landed on my flowers. He wasn't just giving me dead animals. He was watching me. He was taking things out of my system, my world, from my field of vision, and giving me back their eternal, lifeless versions. He was showing me that he had the power to stop the heart of anything that gave me joy. Fear had become an oily film over everything. I kept Leo, my cat, locked up in the house, terrified that he would become Mr. Caspian's next project. My neighbor's gentle smile now seemed like the most hideous mask I had ever seen. He was proof that monstrosity need not be ugly. Sometimes she wears gardening gloves and prunes the roses with surgical precision. The violence of her actions lay in the complete absence of violence in her person. I follow Jean-Paul Sartre's line of thinking, man is nothing more than what he makes of himself. What was Mr. Caspian making of himself with these creatures? An artist? A god of a little world of glass and formaldehyde? And the question that haunted me, what was he trying to make of me? A spectator? An accomplice? A collector? The climax was not a scream, but a gesture. One rainy night, I was standing at the kitchen window, staring into the darkness. Suddenly, Mr. Caspian's porch light came on. He was standing outside in the rain, looking straight at my window. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just raised his right hand and slowly made a gesture in the air, as if he were stroking the fur of an invisible animal the size of a cat. The message was unequivocal. It was a promise. I didn't wait for morning. That same night, I threw a few clothes and everything Leo needed into a suitcase and left through the back door. I stayed at a friend's house, shivering under a blanket as the world I had built dissolved. I hired a moving company to empty the apartment. I never went back. Mr. Caspian had never threatened me verbally, never broken a law. His gifts could be explained away, his observation denied. The terror was in what was left unsaid, in the language of the lifeless bodies left on my doorstep. My grandfather, who was a hunter, used to say that the most dangerous predator is the one you don't hear coming. Mr. Caspian was silent. His threats were not made of words, but of silence, glass, and fur. Does evil need a scream to be real? Or does it manifest itself in the beauty of a bird that will never fly again, left on your doorstep as a promise? My name is Alex. They say suffering ennobles art, but most of the time it just makes you hungry. I was a writer trying to finish a novel, living off of freelance jobs and a lot of ramen noodles. My apartment was cheap, the building was old, and my neighbors were a collection of transient ghosts. Until Madame Alara arrived in the apartment down the hall. I never saw her properly, but I felt her presence, or rather, I smelled her. Her kitchen smelled the most incredible aromas I'd ever smelled. It wasn't the smell of ordinary food. It was complex compositions. Meats roasted with spices I couldn't name. Herbs that smelled of forest and rain. Breads that promised an almost heavenly comfort. The smell wafted down the hallway and tortured me. The strangest thing was that I never saw her carrying grocery bags. The hallway had terrible acoustics. I could hear everything, but her door was a black hole of silence except for those divine aromas. One evening, as I passed by his door, it opened a crack. A pale, slender hand with perfectly manicured nails held out a small porcelain bowl. "For the young writer," said a soft, melodious voice from within, "you must feed your soul." Hunger spoke louder than prudence. I thanked the darkness and took the bowl. Inside was a stew of some sort. The meat was tender, like nothing I'd ever tasted, and the sauce had a flavor that was both familiar and completely alien. It reminded me of a spice my grandmother used, one that smelled of earth and smoke. What was it called? Ah, yes, black cardamom. It had that, but with something else, a subtle sweetness that felt alive. I ate the whole thing in seconds. That night, I didn't have nightmares. I had dreams, vivid narrative dreams, full of ideas and entire paragraphs that seemed to write themselves in my mind. I woke up and wrote for 6 hours straight, the words flowing out of me like a river. I became addicted. Madame Elara's food became my fuel. Every day around 7 o'clock, the door would open and a hand would hand me a new creation. And every night, my mind would open up into a universe of creativity. My novel was becoming brilliant, but the narrative voice sounded less and less like my own. I was becoming a channel, a medium for a story dictated to me by an unknown and delicious muse. Real-world food began to taste like ash. I lost weight, but my manuscript grew fatter. I followed the line of filmmaker David Lynch. Ideas are like fish. If you want to catch small fish, you can stay in shallow water. But if you want to catch big fish, you have to go to deeper water. I was in deep water, but I wasn't the one fishing. The ideas were hooking me. The end came on a Saturday night. She didn't answer the door. I waited for an hour, hunger and withdrawal gnawing at my stomach. The silence of my own brain was deafening. Desperate, I knocked on her door. "Madame Elara, please, I need—" The door opened, but this time, wider than usual, I could see inside her apartment. It wasn't a kitchen, it was a greenhouse, a laboratory. The walls were lined with shelves where, beneath purple heat lamps, the strangest fungi I'd ever seen grew, some pulsing with a faint light, others the color of bruises, herbs with silvery black leaves twined in latticework. And on a metal table in the center, she was cutting a piece of bioluminescent mushroom and mixing it into a paste. There was no stove, no oven, just this alien garden. She turned to me. For the first time, I saw her face. It was ancient, ageless, and her eyes were calm, with the distant curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. "Inspiration always requires sacrifice, young writer," she said, her voice melodious. "The body feeds the mind, and my harvest feeds yours. A fair deal." She closed the door softly in my face. I stumbled back, the smell of earth and decay now making me nauseous. I looked around my apartment at the pile of pages on my desk. They weren't mine. They were the product of that unholy garden. I grabbed my coat, my wallet, and left. I abandoned the manuscript, the apartment, everything. My father, a practical man, always said, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." He had no idea. Madame Elara wasn't offering me food, she was offering me a shortcut, and the toll was me. Does every artist have this hunger, this desire to give themselves up to something greater in exchange for a glimpse of genius? And what happens when the muse you feed decides you're no longer needed for the work?